There's something interesting happening at the moment in the way that male clothes are being presented. They're becoming more about a celebration of the person wearing them than they are this rigid, formulaic way of dressing, which has been the history of menswear for the last 150 years. Originally, I wanted to study women's wear because it was that time in the late 90s, but all the excitement was in women's wear. The change to menswear, I think, came primarily when I went to work at Louis Vuitton in Paris, and I was working in the men's department. That made me consider a male-focused view of fashion much more. But as I then started to work a few years later on my own brand, I started with very much a menswear focus, but I realized that this wasn't really expressing what I wanted to express. So now my approach really, I would say it was gender fluid, even though that's a term that I really dislike. I think there's a focus and a disregard for gender in my work. Anything that I make is pretty much intended to be worn by anyone who wants to wear it. Of course, you do have to take into consideration body shapes, and sometimes there are parts of the body that need to be accommodated and parts that don't. But generally, we really try to work on clothes that can be worn by anyone, because in my opinion, clothes don't have a gender. So the construction on this dress, which is actually really a corset and a skirt, what we did was we followed as closely as we could to the original construction of a robe à l'anglaise, but fanned out, trimmed in, and remounted this whole collar section so it could fit a male torso, whilst at the same time keeping some of these tight, inward moving lines that speak of something that is intrinsically more feminine. To my mind, a lot of what menswear is about is covering the body. But what we wanted to do here was actually celebrate the body, this expansion of décolletage, this emphasis on the form, but then playing with a contrasting volume. The skirt, which was quite a feat of engineering, is very, very tightly packed cartridge pleats, which are then mounted back onto the waistband. In total, I think there were 13.5 meters of fabric within the skirt. And something, if we can find them, that's really gorgeous are these perfectly pattern matched pockets, which were a bit of a trial, but really nicely done in the end. With regards to how this was constructed, it is a really traditional bagged out and boned bodice, and we laced it in the fashion of the original robe à l'anglaise. So you get this zigzagging, knotted at the top, and the tie tucks back on itself. This collection specifically was looking at the history of queer spaces in London, focusing on the early 18th century and this idea of a continuous queer history. So it was really about a reclamation of queerness, a reclamation of space, almost a demanding of attention, and taking a view on queerness but through the lens of beauty. Fundamentally, what's behind my work is this celebration of the outsider. And I think that's hopefully a link to the work of Anna Maria Garthwaite, who was working in London in the 1730s and 40s. She was a textile designer selling her work to weavers in Spitalfields.
It's really wonderful to see a contemporary designer whose work is really about textiles going back and looking at our great textile designers like Anna Maria Garthwaite and drawing inspiration from them and mixing that with a range of references from contemporary life. She was a prolific textile designer, producing up to 80 designs a year. And it's interesting that she's a single woman in her 40s in London when she's producing these designs, and she's really operating in a male-dominated industry. She starts with these very large, bold patterns, and they become finer and finer. And that's something that we see in other works by Edward Crutchley. But in this dress, we see an exaggeration of the large-scale designs that Garthwaite was known for at the beginning of her career.
So the fabric design was very much Garthwaite inspired, and it's these very sinuous lurex lines that are woven in a broccato jacquard with recycled polyester. And within the design, we also added these very tone-on-tone jacquarded logos, which give a richness to the base, but also the logo is quite an evident part of my work. So it's something that is a subtle addition to a historical design. What I love about textiles is it's the way that we interact with fashion. It's the thing that is physically on our bodies. And for me, it's the most effective way to express your identity. But the geek inside me wants to get inside and go, okay, so this, which is a very direct reference to Anna Maria Garthwaite's work. But what I like about this historical referencing is interposing it with things that are very contemporary. So here, working with a faceted nylon yarn to create this liquidity, this weird plasticky sheen next to something very historical, but then printing on the lightest organic twill in 100% silk, but then taking print one step further onto something really over the top, like this gold lurex on these big paper bag trousers, and this mix of something that feels very historical, but something that feels very contemporary, and actually outlandish in a way that I think Anna Maria Garthwaite might have approved of. My aim is perhaps to push, to propose things that can't be done, but we can find a way to do them, but through this lens of something that is very traditional. Alongside that, I also love technology. So I think there's always this push and pull in my work between something that is very craft-based and something that is very technology-based. And where these areas intersect, I think is really exciting. I'm well aware that this is not a realistic proposition for people to wear to the supermarket. But what I hope to achieve by showing this within the realms of menswear is the possibility of what can be used in everyday life, of what people can wear as we move forward as a society that perhaps has less focus on gender and is more about how the male body and people who wear menswear can present themselves in a way that feels more conducive to self-expression and more conducive to a world where gender isn't as relevant.